Okay, so for this session, I'm going to tell you a little story. It's an amazing story. It is a kind of, in a sense, a harrowing story. It is a story that is, in some sense, in terms of, in the context of rabbinic literature, unique to the Yerushalmi, but it also gives you an insight into the generally harrowing and uncertain nature of text transmission in the course of the Middle Ages, as Jews faced persecution in various places, as they moved from place to place as the center of Jewish learning, Jewish life shifted over time. And the story that I want to tell you is one that was not known at all until 25 years ago or so. And there really is, in this case, more than in most cases, there's one person who's really kind of responsible for piecing together and then sharing the story in one kind of remarkable article. Let's see where we have this here. Let's just do that. So when we talk about the transmission over time through history of the Yerushalmi, right, the person who's more responsible for this story more than anyone else is Professor Yaakov Zussman. Professor Zussman was a sort of towering pillar of the Hebrew University Talmud department for 40 years or so. He was a grouchy and somewhat fearsome character. If any of you have seen the movie Footnote, if you haven't seen the movie Footnote, you should read it. It's kind of amazing. A movie that's really an insight into the culture of and sort of the backbiting culture of Jewish studies academia in Israel, and particularly at Hebrew University. One of the main, the sort of mean belittling figure is this guy, Yaakov Zussman. By the time I was able to study with him while I was in rabbinical school, he was already somewhat older and had mellowed out and was just happy to share his experience and wisdom, which is nice. He really is the main person who really devoted himself to studying the Yerushalmi on its own terms. And even as other scholars kind of recovered and rediscovered the Yerushalmi over the course of the 20th century, they mostly did so, they were interested in it because of the opportunities it offered to gain new insight on the Bavli. Zussman really studied and taught the Yerushalmi as its own text with its own structure, logic, and language. And he single-handedly reconstructed this story. So to understand, this is a printed page of the Babylonian Talmud. This is the Vilna version, which originates in the 1880s. One can find various images online of much earlier printings, but the basic structure with the Talmud in the middle and commentaries on the sides was characterized even the earliest printings. The Babylonian Talmud was first printed in the town of Soncino in northern Italy in the early 1500s. It was one of the first Hebrew books to be printed by the brothers Ram in Soncino. And here's what we see. Here's what I want you to see as you look at this text. We have the Mishnah right here over here, and we know that from the early 200s. We have the Gemara, which sort of developed, and it's gradually developed through 600. That Gemara stayed in, it was developed in Bavel, it stayed in Bavel, right? Continued to be taught, studied, and memorized and transmitted. It was first committed to writing probably around 750 when the Arab tribes conquered and overran the Persian Empire and set up their caliphate and empire based in Baghdad. And they were very much a writing culture. So at that point, this text was first committed to writing. Our first references to this text, the parts of, and then the whole Talmud being copied and copies being sent out to communities around the Mediterranean happened probably between around 900 to 950. So at that point, you have multiple copies of this text, of this now written text, being sent to communities, generally communities where there had been a teacher in the community who had come and studied the Babylonian Talmud with the Gaonim in Bavel and then gone home and wanted to teach it to their communities, and asked for copies. Obviously though, once those communities had their own copies of the Talmud and had someone who had learned the interpretations of it from Babylonia, they then no longer felt beholden to Babylonia, and both the text and the knowledge of it radiated outward across Europe from there. So we have a continuous tradition of the study, transmission, and guarding of this text, continuous from the process at the time of its creation, through its careful study in the Babylonian academies, and then with written copies being sent to communities around the Mediterranean and from there into Europe. Furthermore, on this page, we have the commentaries you see, the earliest sort of really major commentary that has remained the sort of defining commentary on the Talmud is Rashi. Rashi was writing in France in the late 11th century, so only a couple hundred, maybe 150 to 200 years after the first written copies came to Europe. And the Tosafot, which it can be dated maybe a century later. So all in all, through the transmission to Europe and then into the work of the Rishonim, we have a continuous record of the study of the Babylonian Talmud and of the preservation of its text in multiple forms and copies. Now, here's a printed page of the Talmud Yerushalmi. You'll notice that the page looks quite a bit like the Bavli page, because that is what Talmuds looked like, and this was understood as a Talmud, which it is. But beyond that, the similarities end. So well, let's start from the and here's where we get into the story that I really want to tell you. So let's first we're going to start at the beginning and then kind of jump to the end and go back. The beginning. We know that the Yerushalmi was completed around the year 400 CE in Eretz Israel, give or take however many years you want to debate. We know that shortly thereafter, Amoraim in Babylonia seem to know and know large portions of what we know of as the Yerushalmi, if not the text in its entirety. We know that they knew the Yerushalmi, so it was completed, and it made its way to Babylonia. In what form? We have no idea. We have no record of it. We have no way of knowing. After that first period, we have no information at all. There's no reference to the Talmud Yerushalmi in the Bavli. There is not a single reference to a text known as the Talmud, even the existence of a text called the Talmud Yerushalmi or any version thereof, for the first 300 years of the Gaonim, until we get a couple of passing references to them to the Yerushalmi in a couple of letters of Gaonim in the 10th century, and then by the early 11th century, Rav Hai Gaon already needs to sort of directly address what the Talmud Yerushalmi is and what its status is. And the famous Gaonic claim that the Babylonian Amoraim knew the Yerushalmi, and if the Bavli disagrees with the Yerushalmi, it means that the later Amoraim rejected the Yerushalmi's view, and therefore if they ever conflict, we never follow the Yerushalmi. That is a statement of Rav Hai Gaon, only because no one before him would have even bothered, or did not even bother to talk about except by chance about the Yerushalmi or its status. So keep that in mind. That only in the 11th century do you have Gaonim even talking about the Yerushalmi. How could the Yerushalmi have been in Bavel and known, right, and get nary a mention? It is hard to reconstruct. It's hard to even imagine what the story might be. We certainly don't have any evidence of such a story. One of the early mentions of the Yerushalmi in the Gaonim in the 10th century is that a Gaon, in response to a question from the community in Kairouan, which was the major in the 10th century, the first major center of rabbinic learning outside of Babylonian Israel. It was in North Africa, what is now Algeria. In response to a question, a Gaon notes, mentions a statement that turns out is in Yerushalmi, and his correspondent is familiar with all of the other texts that the Gaon mentions, indicating that this student knew the entire Talmud Bavli, but the line of Yerushalmi says, "What's that from? I don't have that in my book." So that means they already have the text of the Bavli, but they not only are not familiar, right? And these are obviously serious students. They know this correspondent knows the Bavli well. Not only is this line from the Yerushalmi not familiar to him, he doesn't even seem to have heard of it. Someone who had been in the Babylonian Academy and studied there for some time. Shortly thereafter, in that rough time period, we have a book called the Sefer Mitivot. Sefer Mitivot. I'm gonna let's see if I can come in. No. Let me see if I can just make this like that. Okay, and then Can I put in, say, no, all right, forget it. I'm not going to do that. Sefer Mitivot. Now, Sefer Mitivot, the author of Sefer Mitivot, we can only call him that because we don't have a name, lived and studied in Bavel in the 10th century. He was a student of the Gaonim. There's debate about whether he remained in Bavel or at some point moved to live in Kairouan. But the Sefer Mitivot systematically collects sugyot in the Bavli that have parallels in the Yerushalmi and puts them next to each other. Here's the Bavli text, and here's the Yerushalmi version. Here's the Bavli text and the Yerushalmi. Generally without comment or elaboration, but there's this one truly kind of out of the mainstream text that has identified and intentionally drawn attention to the many parallels between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and obviously just the juxtaposition calls out for interpretation. Immediately thereafter, the two truly sort of famous rabbinic pillars of the Kairouan community, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nissim, develop this avid interest in the Yerushalmi. They start to study it in great depth. They use they have commentaries on their own commentaries on the Talmud, in which they incorporate and cite quite a bit of Yerushalmi. It seems as though at this point, the Talmud Yerushalmi which had been lost or simply preserved, but basically ignored in Babylonia for centuries, was rediscovered, and through this, the author of Sefer Mitivot and his two students, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rav Nissim Gaon in Kairouan, not only rediscovered, but placed at the center of what it meant to do Talmud study. Now, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nissim inaugurate a sort of golden period for the Yerushalmi of about 300 years, when a whole range of Rishonim are very interested in Yerushalmi, in comparing it to the Bavli, in rethinking and re-understanding Bavli texts based on the Yerushalmi, etc. So there's 300 years of that. So that 300 years is the first kind of golden age of Yerushalmi study, where there were multiple major rabbinic scholars, Kairouan in Italy, in Provence in Spain, and even a couple up in northern France, who took great interest in and frequently talk about and cite the Yerushalmi. After that, interest in it kind of drops off precipitously. We have a good 300 years where we hear very little. Actually, we have a long period where we hear very little about it. It does get printed in the mid-1500s, and so once it is printed, we see people sort of making reference to it, but it's only in the 1700s when the Vilna Gaon was ideologically committed to expanding the scope of the rabbinic library. And so after many centuries of rabbis and their students really studying only the Bavli, the Vilna Gaon reclaimed the Tosefta and the Midrash and the collections of Midrash Halacha and the Yerushalmi and other other rabbinic texts that would expand the conversation and offer new perspectives on Bavli. That's why in that period of sort of resurgence and renewed interest, the Korban Eda and Pnei Moshe, students of the Vilna Gaon, were then who saw that there was really no tradition of explanation of commentary on the Bavli, came to write their commentaries. Now, here's where it gets, here's where the reconstructing starts. The Yerushalmi was printed in 1530s, the first time. The printers write that they scoured all of Europe and could only find one complete manuscript of the Yerushalmi. And they traveled around to the major rabbinic centers around Europe. Nobody had a copy of the Yerushalmi. Nobody had a copy of the Yerushalmi. There were little, like there were copies of like a Masechta here, a few pages there. But for most of the Yerushalmi, they had only this one copy. This is something that has been long kind of known. They printed it. The printers say, we are aware that this copy is full of errors, and there are also problems with the text. There's nothing that we can do. With the Bavli, normally, with the Bavli, when they came to print it, they tried to use multiple manuscripts so that they would catch and be able to identify and catch and correct any transmission errors in the text. They did this usually successfully with some, with some problems, but they are saying they could not do anything comparable with the Yerushalmi. They're literally in all of Europe, as far as they knew, and they looked, there was only one complete manuscript of the Yerushalmi in existence. In the mid-19th century, the scholars of the sort of the Wissenschaft, academic Judaism scholars in the mid-19th century in Germany were alerted to a manuscript that turned out to be of the Yerushalmi that was in a library in a town called in the University of Leiden. Here's just a page from let's see if we can get a page from that manuscript. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to, just so you can get a sense of what it looks like. People were thrilled because there had, we know that you couldn't correct the printers couldn't correct the Yerushalmi because there was no text compared to. And here was our opportunity, right? So Zachariah Frankel, one of the great sort of figures of that sort of scholarly movement, went to see this manuscript. He looked through several sections. He concluded, disappointed, that the places where the printed Yerushalmi had errors, this manuscript had the same errors and therefore it wasn't going to be helpful. It took another 80 years. So he saw it. He's like, it doesn't have anything that it isn't going to help us anything. It took another 80 years till Saul Lieberman figured out that, in fact, this manuscript was the manuscript that the printers were talking about. This is the manuscript, the only complete manuscript that they used to prepare the first printing. And we know this because the sort of chalk or pencil marks of the printers and then their notes in preparing it for printing and noting both the year, how many years had passed since the manuscript had been written, and where they were starting new pages and corrections that they had found in other fragments, are all written in the margins of this manuscript. So this was physically the manuscript that the printers had in hand and that they used. It was the only surviving manuscript. What had happened to it? After the printing was completed, it was put in, perhaps returned to the personal library of a Protestant theologian in the town of Leiden, went into a drawer somewhere, never to be looked at again. When he passed away, it, along with his entire collection of books, went to the library of the University of Leiden. And literally from the time of that printing in the around 1530 until Zachariah Frankel in 1850 something, no Jewish scholar ever laid eyes on the only surviving complete manuscript of the Yerushalmi. And the only reason that we have the text of the Yerushalmi at all. This manuscript was itself, and this we know from the colophon, the notes of the scribe that he made when he completed. He made sort of notes of like, I'm completed this on this day of this year. This was done. It was completed in the in around just after 1300. So around 1300. So right at the end of the period of ferment of, when the active ferment of Yerushalmi study kind of was coming to its end. So one would think, well, that's why this is the only surviving manuscript, because in the 240 years, 30 years between the completion of the manuscript and its printing, no one was studying the Yerushalmi. And so no one made copies of it. And so that was the real danger time in the transmission of the Yerushalmi. Turns out not to be the case. We're going to have one more session talking about this. So I'm going to stop here and continue the story in the next session.